Wherever there is a villain, there must be a hero, and wherever there is a monster, convention dictates there must also be a slayer. Without Beowulf, who would even remember Grendel? Every good story needs a nemesis. And if Van Helsing was the first vampire slayer, then Buffy is surely the greatest. We all knew how to kill vampires before Buffy came along. A wooden stake through the heart, or beheading, or sunlight usually did the job. But Buffy changed our expectations of what a vampire slayer should look like. She wasn't a crusty old man. She was a perky blonde teen who had to fit slaying in around homework assignments and cheerleading tryouts. She might have been young, but she was stronger than any vamp, and wisecracking with it. The vampires of Sunnydale, California had to shape up to fight her, and so the now almost ubiquitous notion of the vampire with martial arts skills was born. In Kristine Kathryn Rusch's story, Hero Dust, we find an homage to the idea of the teenage girl as slayer, the once-in-a-generation figure whom mankind can depend upon to save us from the monsters. And we realise that heroes aren't always who we expect them to be.
Weighed in the balance, hero dust is vile as vulgar clay. Lord Byron, Ode to Napoleon Bonaparte. The weather that summer was frightful. Much later, nearly 200 years later, he learnt that the amazing storms with their torrential downpours and terrifying lightning shows occurred as a meteorological reaction to the eruption of the volcano Tambora in Indonesia. But on those nights in 1816, which he spent listening to the voices echo from the veranda, the weather seemed like some special gift from hell. Bram was not supposed to be there. George Gordon Noel Byron, the 6th Baron Byron, had his doctor, John Polidori, rent the villa, so no one would know that the famous poet planned to spend the summer on the shore of Lake Geneva. But Bram wasn't there to see Lord Byron. He had never heard of the man before that May. Bram had come because his mentor had ordered it. His mentor, a man whose name Bram never spoke, not even now, because heroes, Bram had been taught, were not, should not ever be, remembered. The stars say a power will emerge near the summer solstice, his mentor had said. The world shall change at the Villa Diodati. One of us must be there. We must see if we can harness that power and use it for good. Bram had little money and no friends, never before having been outside the city of Amsterdam. But he managed, and he found the Villa Diodati hiding in its gardens when the only renters it would have all year arrived. At that time, Bram could not see how a summer full of poetry and declamation would change the world. Now he cannot imagine the world without that summer, without that change, without the competitive ghost stories and the truths buried therein. Bram sits in the back of the large classroom, his eyes closed. Once he stood in the well at the base of the long flight of stairs, his arms resting on the podium. He had found his best assistants that way, teaching things that could no longer be taught, phrenology and other types of medicine now discredited. The students he'd met there, men who were willing to steal corpses so that they could study anatomy, had the perfect elements to help Bram in his fight to stop the undead. But modern students were not like that, and Bram's qualifications as a teacher had vanished along with the 19th century. He had never thought, when it became clear that he did not age like other men, it is because, his mentor had said to him, you know how to believe in impossible things, that he would outgrow his education, and, in some ways, his usefulness. Abraham Van Helsing, M.D., D.F.H., D.Lit., etc., etc. But he had been forced to drop that name in 1897 after Bram Stoker had published his still famous novel. Stoker lived up to his agreement to conceal all the names involved, all except Van Helsing's, of course, claiming that the world needed to know such an heroic man existed. How will they find you, man, if they discover a great evil that must be vanquished? But that was how it had worked from time immemorial. The augurs, combined with science and knowledge, would send someone, once his mentor or his mentor's mentor, and finally Bram, to the right place to do the right thing. This lecture hall is filled with more than 100 students, most of them young, most of them with tattoos and piercings and multicoloured hair. The class is one of 1,000 he has attended at colleges and universities all over America. Each one has a similar title: the hero in literature, the hero's journey, the hero in history. Most are unimaginative, using Joseph Campbell as their base. Still, because of these classes, Bram has learnt of acts of heroism the world over and throughout time, and he has learnt, as the students have learnt, that men are often flawed. But he has not found what he's seeking. There are different types of heroism, and his is a dark form. He needs someone who will steal a corpse to learn how to save a man, not a man who will do everything he can to prevent the corpse from being stolen. So the only thing he can think of is to approach men who study heroism, to see if they've seen that remarkable courage in themselves or in someone else. This small university is his last attempt at this tactic. He has heard through websites and bulletin boards that this place has a star professor, one who seems to understand more than all the others, who can impart that which no other teacher can, what it truly means to be a hero. So Bram is here not to learn, but to observe, and to hope that this time at last he will find his successor. At first, the days in the middle of that June were radiant, sun against a high blue sky, reflecting on the pristine waters of that mountain lake. When he went to Switzerland, Bram had been indentured for 5 years. He was barely 16 years old. Odd that he can remember those years with such clarity. Later years blur, particularly the world wars. They seem like one long war, and he must remind himself that there was a period of silence between, a period in which evil rebuilt itself and started anew. "Our definition of heroism changes," the young professor's voice booms out of the loudspeakers. "After 9/11, we started to recognize the everyday heroism in firefighters, people who risk their lives every time they answer a call. The New York City firefighters became weary of the label after a while. For months afterward, they appeared on television claiming they weren't heroes, they were just regular guys." Bram squirms in his chair. How many times has he heard this variation? Clearly this young professor is not the man that Bram had heard about. A young woman sitting next to him fiddles with a textbook. She is petite, dark-haired, and as uninterested as he is. Out of the corner of his eye he thinks he sees the title, Heroism for Dummies. Bram blinks, looks, realizes his mistake. Graduate School for Dummies. He has heroism on the brain. But what are heroes if not regular guys? We elevate the brave among us and assume they lead perfect lives. Then we tear down the pedestal when we realize they're made of the same vulgar clay as the rest of us. Vulgar clay caught Bram's attention. The young professor has not only read Byron, he remembers enough to quote Byron. A shiver runs down Bram's back. Byron. The Byron of his memory is not the Byron who lives through history. The historical Byron is a romantic figure, larger than life, with black hair and beautiful eyes. The man who unwittingly became the model of the modern vampire, tall and suave, a rich man with no soul, who must steal the lives of others in order to live. Byron himself would have laughed at the characterization. What is a writer, after all, he would have said, but a creature who steals the lives of others in order to survive? The Byron Bram observed was a too thin man with a ghastly, pale face. His voice had no beauty to it, too nasal, too harsh. Nonetheless, it compelled. But Byron was the instigator, the man who suggested the gathering tell each other ghost stories every night, the man who saw the world as a competition between himself and everyone else, particularly his friend, Percy Bysshe Shelley. The real Byron had a quick mind, a cutting sense of humour, and an insecurity so vast that it hid itself behind arrogance, for only arrogance could hide Byron's most obvious flaw, his unwieldy club foot, which often forced him to cut adventures short because of the pain it sent along his leg. It was that Byron who told a fragment of a story about a nobleman named Augustus Darvel who contrived to return from the dead. "Studies have shown," the professor is saying to an increasingly less attentive class, "that heroes are rare precisely because they are heroes. In other words, heroes have an innate disposition to run toward danger when any sensible person would run away." Suddenly he has Bram's attention again. He leans forward in his chair. "Most of us fall in the middle. When trouble occurs, we look for help. The lower end of the bell curve are those people who freeze in an emergency, and the upper end are the heroes, the ones who seek out danger. These reactions come from a genetic predisposition and can only be changed slightly. The reactions happen from the subconscious, the animal brain, and not from the conscious mind at all." The animal brain. Bram used to call it the child mind, but later learnt that wasn't exactly accurate. "So," the professor is saying, "the hero sees danger and rushes to end it with no thought to himself, or herself." Bram leans back in his chair, mulling the words, "rush toward danger." He rarely rushed. Usually he walked slowly, knowing he was risking everything. Even that first time he walked into a crypt. Bram was barely 18. He clutched a stake in his right hand and an axe in his left, his mentor behind him with the lantern whose light cast shadows on the crypt wall. Bram's conscious mind told him he was being foolish, that he should run, and quickly, yet his feet did not listen. He walked forward, his heart pounding and his breath coming in quick gasps as he approached the resting place of his very first undead. "You all right?" The young girl sitting next to him touches his arm. "You looked a little grey there for a second." Bram blinks. It takes him a moment to leave the past, a sign that he is getting old. "I was just thinking of something else." And his voice sounds rusty, as if he hasn't used it for a long time. The girl laughs. "Aren't we all?" Her face is narrow, with large eyes and a generous mouth. Her slightness and the intelligence in those eyes remind him of Percy Bysshe Shelley's lover, Mary Godwin. "I'm just sitting in, listening," Bram says, "hoping for something different." "Oh, that would have been last semester," the girl says. "Professor Miller is new. The guy who used to teach this class, Professor Addison, he got hired away by Yale." At that moment, the bell rings. The professor finishes his sentence, but no one listens. The girl stands and cradles her books to her chest. Bram starts to stand, slips and falls heavily into his chair. He closes his eyes against the pain. He is useless and has not found someone to replace him. He has managed over the years to get the information out, to use fiction to explain how to destroy vampires, but he cannot get people to believe such creatures actually exist, to believe in them enough to fight them anyway. "Are you all right?" the girl asks again. He forces his eyes open, then makes himself smile. "I'm fine." Her concern touches him. He slides out of the row of chairs, waits, and offers her a hand to help her onto the steps. She looks at him as if he has made an alien gesture, then she smiles and places her hand in his own. She is perhaps 18, barely at the beginning of her life, and he has lived 200 years more than her. He wonders if she would believe that, if her soon-to-be college-educated mind will allow her to take in the fantastic as well as the scientific. She slips her hand out of his, but remains beside him on the stairs. "Are you sure you're all right?" she asks. "You seem upset or something." "I am not finding what I'm looking for," he says, "and I am getting weary." She tilts her head to one side. "What are you looking for?" His back straightens. He has waited almost a decade to hear that question, and now he hears it from the mouth of a young girl, a girl whom, like all the rest of the fair sex, he is sworn to protect. He knows it is the birth of the vampire story, which was the seminal event of that soggy June 2 centuries ago that changed the world, but Byron's fragment, as he later called it, was unremarkable. Bram might have forgotten that story altogether if he hadn't been so stunned at Byron's knowledge of the undead, knowledge that John Polidori expanded upon in his novella, the one which introduced a vampire named Lord Riven. He was so clearly Lord Byron that no one seemed to notice the fictional vampire was the first to reveal what factual vampires were actually like. No, what Bram remembers of that June is Mary Godwin, who sat across from her soon-to-be husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley. "Your tales of ghouls and goblins," she said, "and that horrid discussion about discovering the principles of life have given me nightmares." Her voice gained strength as she began to turn her nightmare into a story, not of ghosts, but of a thing that seemed alive and was not. As she spoke, her face had a paleness to it, the wide eyes, her uplifted chin revealing the naked throat. He had thought, as he watched her in the candlelight, that she, more than anyone else, would be the vampire's desired mate. "May I buy you a coffee?" he asks the young girl, knowing her generation's predilection for the sweetened, creamed, and overly strong drink. It reminds him of Vienna before the war, the First World War, a city that was then filled with coffee drinkers who liked to talk too much about nothing important, and later a city that became the home of so very many undead. The girl gives him half a smile, and he knows she will say no. Why should she say yes? People that young have no interest in the old. "Oh, what the hell," she says. "A double tall sounds good." He gives her a slight bow, which makes her laugh, and then follows her up the stairs. She won't let him carry her books or her laptop, saying she is used to the wait. He is astonished still at the independence and the strength of these young women. He knows that the culture has given them permission to be so. He also knows that they no longer have a real imperative to be feminine, have children, and raise a family. But he finds this new breed of female unfathomable, and this girl is no different from the others. Her tight blue jeans are too short at the hips, and her shirt is cropped too high, revealing her stomach. Bram looks away. This new openness embarrasses him. He cannot change 150 years of training as quickly as he would like. The coffee shop is part of the student union. The girl orders her double tall, and he orders a simple espresso, hoping that the barista behind the counter makes it correctly. The girl leads Bram to one of the tall round tables. "You finishing up your degree?" she asks. "No," he smiles. "I have too many useless degrees as it is." she says, "and sometimes a person turns into a perpetual student, staying in college because it's safe, not because she has a game plan." She extends her hand. "I'm Clarissa, by the way." The good old-fashioned name surprises him. He takes the hand, holds it as if he is going to kiss it, then releases it. Bram. "I never met anyone called Bram before." She leans back in her chair. "If you're not taking classes, what are you doing here?" That question again, framed differently, but with the same meaning. He surprises himself when he says, "I am searching for someone with an open mind." He finally spoke to her 7 years later in London. Mary Shelley, by then a widow and the acknowledged author of her novel Frankenstein, or Modern Prometheus, attended the first play made from her work. Bram was free then, no longer indentured. He was in London on other business and went to the play out of curiosity, not realizing she was going to be there. Instead of watching the play, he watched her, an old habit that came back easily. She sat with a small smile on her face, wincing only once when the assistant shouted, "It lives, it lives," a line too overwrought to be in her finely tuned novel. After the show, people surrounded her, asked her opinion. "I was much amused," she would say over and over again. Finally, the crowd departed, and she turned to her companions, asking one of them to hail a hansom cab. At that moment, Bram stepped before her, bowed at the waist, and introduced himself as a student and fan of her work. "I was in Lake Geneva when you wrote the tale," he said. "I worked in the garden." Even though she was only 23, she had frown lines, and her girl's body was long lost to children and despair. He had heard that she supported herself now on her own writings, having no money or recognition from her husband's estate. "I thought I had seen you before," she said, but there was no joy in her tone. "That was a strange summer," he said. "Yes," she glanced over her shoulder. "Sometimes I feel like I created my own vampire. It lives, even though at times I wish it would simply die." He stood in shock, not knowing how to respond. She tapped him lightly with her gloved fingers. "Oh, pay me no mind. The world is not what I thought it then, and I am no longer a girl whose illusions were being shattered, but a woman who knows more of darkness than she ever cared to see." She stepped away from him and to the cab waiting outside. Bram wanted to spend much more time with her. He too had become disillusioned, learning more than he cared to know about the violence that haunted the night. But she got into the carriage before he could call to her and didn't look out the window as the carriage drove away. "Do you believe in stories?" he asks the girl, this Clarissa with the classical name and such a familiar face. "Do you believe they have the power to transform, even to save? Is that why you're going to the hero classes? You're looking for stories that save?" He waves a hand. No, I'm talking about fiction, that inside its apparent untruths there are actual truths. Do you believe this?" "Sure," she says. Her tone humours him. "Why?" "I look for people who have the capacity to believe in the impossible." He hasn't spoken of this in nearly 100 years. And the first step in finding those people is finding people who accept that there is truth in fiction. "I don't see how that relates to heroes," she says. "Ah," he says, "heroes always believe in the impossible." "They do?" Professor Miller was saying that heroics is a matter of destiny, heredity, if I heard him right, like we have no choice. We always have a choice. The fact that Bram is sitting before her is a choice. The fact that he has had a long life is a choice. It is just not one he can make again. "If you were to choose now," he says, "what kind of life would you have?" She gives him a wistful half-smile. "It wouldn't be this." "What would it be?" She shrugs. "Something unusual, something adventurous, something heroic?" Her eyes seem to light from within. Then she looks down. "That's just silly." "It is not," he says. "I've lived it. I've lived 1,000 impossible things." She looks up at him. "I had a hunch you'd be interesting," she says. "You have that look." He smiles at that. He nods toward her book. "Are you applying to graduate school?" She puts a restless hand on top of it. "I don't know. I'm hoping something else will come along." She is the first candidate, the only candidate he has come across in more than a decade of searching. He doesn't have much time left, yet it is hard for him. Even though he knows that women are strong, he is still a product of his upbringing. He doesn't want to risk her. Then he realizes why she looks familiar. She has that edge, that darkness he saw so many years ago in the young Mary Godwin, another woman who did not know what she wanted to do, a woman who taught him about the power of stories, enough so that he later sought out a writer to tell the tale of how to kill vampires, so that people could become familiar with the methods. He had chosen Stoker, but all that time he had been thinking of Mary Shelley. "Oh, it won't, though, will it, unless I choose?" The girl is speaking, and he has to concentrate. His wandering mind, the worst part of his old age. He smiles at her. "What would you say to a few months spent talking about stories? Stories of impossible things." "Where would we talk?" she asks, and the suspicion of her generation, the fears of perverts and murderers and all kinds of man-made horrors lurks behind her eyes. "Here," he says, trying to seem as harmless as possible. "I'll buy you a cup of coffee every afternoon for an hour of your time." "Why me?" she asks after a moment. "Because," he says, "you ask questions." "Is that all?" He shakes his head. "Because you also remind me of a woman I used to admire." That seems to appease the girl. "Will you tell me about her?" Clarissa asks. "Eventually," he says, "when I'm sure you'll believe me." "I'm sure I'll believe you," Clarissa says. Bram just smiles. He knows after more than 200 years the human capacity for disbelief. He shares it. He is struggling against it even now, all that training which taught him a woman could not succeed him, even though the evidence of his eyes, of his life, disputes it. "So," she says, "are you going to tell me a story?" He wraps his hand around his coffee cup. "I'm going to tell you a story about stories," he says, "and how, when the right elements come together, they can change the world."
David Horovitch was reading Hero Dust by Kristine Kathryn Rusch. The presenter was Natalie Haynes, and the story was abridged and produced by Gemma Jenkins.